Look at him right there. Shit. Sorry. Anyway, so, you know, John, I met John like, I think it was like 6 or 7 years ago. You know, I was chair of the department back then. And this guy wrote an email message to me. He made an appointment and I received him in my office. And after a half-hour, 45-minute conversation, I realized that, you know, I had been talking to someone with amazing talent, someone who had a wonderful academic training, someone who had outstanding experiences living in Spain, doing a master's degree in Spain, and also teaching Spanish in the trenches of New York City public schools. So it was at that point that John started the process of applying to do his doctorate in our program, process after which he was successful. And he started the PhD and he totally fulfilled our expectations and exceeded them. There was a period when John was debating what to work on. You know, he had several fascinating ideas with regards to in which direction to take his research. And it was ultimately when he met my dear friend and colleague, Cici Cutler, who's there, I see her name right there, when he finally found the interlocutor that he needed. And he started to conduct research on a concept of the Afroamericano, on which he himself is going to tell us about very soon. John defended his dissertation. Was it May, John? It was back in May, wasn't it? Or June, May or June? April. It was in April. And well, Cici Cutler was the director, and I had the honor of being a member of his dissertation committee together with our also wonderful Miki Makihara. And it was a true pleasure to be a part of that dissertation defense. So when we thought about organizing this event, we immediately thought of John, because we wanted, you know, when you talk about diversity, it's important to look at diversity from a variety of angles. And in this regard, it was important for us to have, you know, experienced scholars like Eva or Juan, together with someone who is an outstanding scholar, but just starting his professional life. And we thought that bringing together the different tones of the voices that have been in the profession for different periods of time would be most interesting. So that's all I'm going to say about you, John. I am delighted to see you. I miss our lunches at that Moroccan restaurant on 36th Street very much. Hope we get back to that as soon as possible. And the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Okay. All right, here I am. So the title of my work is Afroamericano, the Racialization of the African-American Spanish Speaker. And my complete work is on Google Scholar. So if you'd like to search my name with this term, it should definitely come up on Google Scholar. The title of my dissertation rests heavily on racialization, which is the ideological process that we use to kind of build ideas about who people are based on the color of their skin. So how Black people are, how Black people speak, and the ideas that we use to kind of build these structures in our heads about what Black English is and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and who has license to speak what language. And so we use, or Elaine used, transracialization as a term that kind of plays off of racialization. So transracialization is a linguistic term that I use to describe the sociocultural act of recontextualizing one's phenotype using the language that they speak, and in so doing, upending an interlocutor's expectations of who you are and what your background may be with language. All right. So In my study, I interviewed Spanish-speaking African Americans in both multi-ethnic communities as well as on social media platforms like YouTube. And I interviewed them just to see how they were modifying definitive racial labels by becoming pedagogues of Spanish and speaking Spanish in their homes, communities, schools, and jobs. And this is the working definition that I'm using for Afroamericano. So this graphic is helpful to kind of understand the next frontier of transracialization that may eliminate the need for contrasts between groups that were previously recognized as different. So on the right-hand side, you have the Afro-Latino, Dominican New Yorker of a certain complexion who speaks a Dominican variety of Spanish and also some features from Ave. On the left-hand side, you have an African-American New Yorker who probably speaks standard English and elements of Ave. And then in the middle, someone who looks identical to the two on the outside, you have an African American who has had the lived experience of growing up in a Spanish speaking community alongside Spanish speakers who are as dark and even darker than they are. And the term that I'm using for this person in the middle is Afroamericano, because the language repertoire represents elements of multiple different ethnicities, even though they look similar. So what I'm proposing is that as people begin to view themselves and each other is not as African American or Dominican, but as a wide range of mix and match elements and features of colors and languages and cultural elements, we'll begin to see that these have no real guaranteed established links as many people would assume. So the question, are you Black or Hispanic, really is a language question. Many times at the school I used to work at was an international school. And I taught all native speakers, heritage speakers of Spanish. And they used to ask me, are you Black or Hispanic? And so it was kind of difficult to answer that question until I read more about how we're categorizing these terms. And are you Black or Hispanic is basically a language question. It's synonymous with do you speak Spanish or is at least one of your parents from a Spanish speaking nation, not necessarily indexing your race, right? Because if you speak Spanish and you're Dominican and your skin is comparable to mine, then that somehow means you would choose Hispanic in that dichotomy and not Black, even though it's not so easy to separate those two terms out. So these were the 4 questions that I sought to ask before I started the research. Just playing off of Alkoff's 2000 idea that what unites Latinos is not race or phenotype, but a set of diverse cultures rich with linguistic, religious, historical, and traditional similarities. And I'm positing then that Afroamericano is another sort of ethnic group that can fall underneath the umbrella of Latinx. So these are a few of the ideas from the research that I used in my kind of foregrounding. Bailey's repertoire of identities, the fact that Dominican Americans in many instances will have multiple different ways of identifying themselves, and also this idea from Buchholz about these principles as to how our identities come into being. Emergence meaning it's easiest to tell someone's identity when it's unexpected. Indexicality referring to the fact that we can't really have any ideas about racial linguistics without rooting ourselves in some types of cultural beliefs or values that display an evaluative process about how you evaluate people based on their speech. And relationality just meaning how we relate to each other. How does my Blackness as an African American relate to a Dominican American, for example, who is of equal complexion? So the themes that center Blackness in my work are the effects of proximity and positioning in urbanized areas, as well as passing and styling in Latinx Hispanic communities. these two things kind of blended together more and more as I kind of go through my work. There's not a clear line of that distinguishes between the two of them. Um, also, also, there were two halves of my research. So for my project, I based the first half on interviews with actual Afro-Americanos that were in and around New York City. And for the second half of my project, I did a YouTube analysis of the Afro-Americano presence on YouTube. And so for this presentation, I'm kind of blending the findings from both those halves into the same space, because I know we're all pressed for time and I want to get as much relayed to you as possible. So for an example of proximity, this is an excerpt of something that one of my respondents said. I absolutely orientated myself toward Caribbean Spanish. When I was in school, if it veered a little towards Spain or an accent from Spain, people would wonder, why the hell do I sound like that? And she says that she wanted to get closer to people not far away. So we can see that she kind of used the proximity that she had to people in her community to kind of orient herself through a new identity and building for herself. Another example of that would be how this person, Kalina, says that when she's in a Spanish restaurant in her neighborhood, she always speaks Spanish to the wait staff that works there, and she just makes it feel like she's positioning herself in a way that's more amenable to the situation and not expecting them um, to get closer to her. And this is a person who's living in Harlem, in the border between Harlem and Washington Heights, in a highly populated area by Dominican Americans. And so she kind of negotiates her way through the space using language in a way that gets her closer to her community members. Um, as far as passing and crossing goes, this quote previously that I shared kind of proves that people intend to form their Spanish around certain varieties for certain reasons, and we'll look deeper into that as I go along. But when people say that L2 speakers can and do make phonological choices that involve pronunciation skills um, and a keen awareness of their sociolinguistic variation, it's this type of example that I'm talking about, because as this person, Tiana, says, when she started to pick up a Caribbean accent, Spanish speakers in New York were more willing to allow her pass into their culture. She was more accepted in social spaces. So that also, too, is another reason why Afro-Dominicanos are choosing Caribbean dialects of Spanish instead of, you know, varieties from Spain or Mexican style Spanish, because it allows them a gateway or a passageway into their culture, as Tiana says. So one of the themes that emerged was also the fact of how shocked people are when a Black person speaks Spanish. And I just think this goes to the destabilization that I talked about before, of how the identity of a person really comes into being when it's unexpected. So I'm going to play this video from 136 to 250.
Hey YouTube, this your girl Amber Gonzalez from the channel Amber Gonzalez. After I finished talking to them or whatever, as we were walking, he says to me,
"You don't look bilingual."
What? I don't look bilingual? Like, I was thrown off. Like, listen guys, I'm usually thrown off and I'm so late. Like, my comebacks be like 10 minutes later when I actually realize that you have just tried to be a smart behind. So I'm posing this question to you all because I don't know, like, I know there are a lot of you that watch me that speak 3 or 4 languages just like I do, and I don't know, like, do you guys ever get this? Have you ever heard of this before, that you don't look bilingual? What exactly do this mean? Like, if someone can please explain to me what exactly does this mean, and coming from this person, I don't look bilingual. So just just to explain, for me, in my mind, I'm thinking like, if anything, you don't look bilingual. All my friends are bilingual. All of my brown friends and my black friends and my African friends, all of them speak several languages, especially from Africa.
Okay, so one
Hey
of
YouTube, this
the...
your girl Amber Gonzalez from the channel Amber
Hello.
Gonzalez.
Okay, so one of the comments, I also analyzed a large swaths of commentary on YouTube in response to these topics. And basically the consensus, both in interviews with respondents and YouTube participants, is that Spanish speakers are more amenable to Afro-Americanismo in African-American speaking Spanish, whereas whites and Black African-American monolingual speakers are not as amenable. This person shares her experience of how she was in a doctor's office helping a Colombian woman, and it was actually an older African-American gentleman that was, she says, here in the fourth line up from the bottom, looked at her like she was crazy for wanting to learn Spanish. So, so the reactions aren't, they follow a specific pattern. So another thing that has kind of come out in the research is sexuality. Most of the respondents that I interviewed for this study were gay Black men. I couldn't find anything in their stories that would kind of alert me as to why it seems not to be a heteronormative pattern, but this is just kind of a theme that I'm playing with that I haven't really fleshed out all the way, but it just seems that out of all the people that received the information I was looking for, respondents for this particular topic, the 6 men that replied were all gay Black men in the subject of Black men speaking Spanish. One of them kind of alluded to the fact that in the Caribbean, having a fluid sexuality is more common. And when he interacts with heterosexual Black men, he feels more on the outs than he does in the Caribbean community. So that may be a possible line of inquiry. I'm looking for a full grasp of all different types of inroads that African Americans use to learn Spanish, and this is definitely seems to be a possible inroad. Just a case in point, I myself came out while I was studying abroad in Puerto Rico. I just felt that I was learning Spanish down there, and the environment was more amenable to me doing that, just the culture and the way people treated me. And I found that across the board, a lot of the men could relate to that experience versus, being in the Black community and having to deal with higher levels of homophobia. So moving along, this quote from Walpott I think was interesting that I wanted to include. Okay, I got 5 minutes left, perfect. Just that as a political statement, Spanish-speaking African Americans are destabilizing. So in this example, the respondent talks about how when Spanish is used in Latinx communities as anti-Blackness, a Black Spanish speaker kind of destabilizes the ability for darker-skinned Caribbeans and Hispanic people to kind of separate themselves from Blackness. So in this, I just want to finish up quickly by talking about how the construction of ethno-linguistic identity is really, it's really tantamount to the repertoire of identities and the expansion of identities. And transracialization, I just want to finish on this point, doesn't really imply that someone is changing their ethnicity more than they're just adding a different layer, a different nuance to how they navigate the world and how they appear in the world. This is a podcast that appears on YouTube in which she says that she's not trying to be something that she's not, but that being that she's married to a Dominican man, it's impossible for for that influence not to rub off on her. I just want to, I included this because I wanted to include about how the community of Afroamericanos establish relationships online. The growing community of Black people that speak Spanish helps to create relationships and establish relationships that might not have taken place before. And also, as African Americans begin to learn Spanish, they become pedagogues of Spanish, like myself. There are many different channels of Black people who have become teachers of Spanish and recruit other people to learn Spanish and kind of steer them towards Dominican and Puerto Rican and Cuban styles and varieties and cultures, and not towards other cultures. And that the understanding of why that is central to my work. And I'm hoping to add into the social linguistic landscape in the fields of identity and social linguistics. These three authors, these three works on the top were central to what I built my work off of. And I'd like to also add to second language acquisitions because I think pedagogy is a very important part of this that's underrepresented. African Americans are underrepresented in second language acquisition. I'm teaching in class now with a textbook for Spanish 101 class at a university, prominent university, and you know, the short films that go along with each lesson are, you know, an American young white girl that goes to Mexico and lives with a white Mexican family. There's no Black people at all, no Black influences, no Black speech, no Black varieties, no Black rhythms. And so I'm in the process of building advanced grammar classes that teach Spanish, but that center Blackness and the Black experience. So that's what I'm working on now. So I will stop share. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for your work. Thank you for your presentation. So we have about 10 minutes now for questions, for comments. If you would like to turn on your video and unmute yourself, please put your name in the chat and I'll call on folks as long as I can for 10 minutes. So we welcome thoughts and also commentary in the chat. We can make that a live space as well. I see thank yous coming in. I see affirmation.
I don't see any, no one said stack, so.
No one said stack, which is the technical term for can I turn on my mic? But yes, welcome everyone. Any thoughts, any comments, we welcome them for sure. I have a question, John. I'm thinking about the tension in the duality of understanding identity and then destabilizing identity, as you say, at the same time. So can you say a little bit about how you grapple with that using these identity markers that you then destabilize by thinking in intersectional sociolinguistic ways? How does that work for you?
So for me personally, I find that people need to know your story. So one of the common themes that appeared in the research and a vignette that I actually start my dissertation with is people always asking, oh, pero ¿dónde tú eres? Always the first thing they want to know. Where are you from? What's your story? Because when they see you, they don't expect to hear you speak Spanish, even though there are a lot of Afro-Latinos. When you speak Spanish in public spaces, and you don't look like a person that speaks Spanish, you're always getting the where are you from questions because people want to link, people want some type of narrative that explains why you have the linguistic repertoire that you do. And one of the things that my research destabilizes is that you don't have to be from the Dominican Republic to adapt Dominican features into your speech and to use those features to navigate spaces that are full of Dominicans. So for example, in my research, a lot of people spoke about just using that connection because it endears people to you in some type of ways. One girl spoke about being in an art exhibit, and there were a lot of other women there that kept switching back to her in English. And then when she started to speak in Spanish, it was just like, oh, we're at a Spanish event. Let's all speak Spanish. Let's all come to the table, because it signals that the person is willing to come to the table as they are and share in the linguistic atmosphere. So it's a juggling of identities that can only happen in a space where there are multiple identities, if that makes any sense.
Very much so. Thank you. I received a stack from Ana Celia Centella. So welcome, Doctora Centella. And then we have other comments I know building in the chat as well. Welcome.
Hola.
Hola, buenas.
A ver si me ven.
Ahí,
Ok.
ahora sí.
Muchas gracias, John. Te
De nada.
votaste, as we say in
Gracias.
Puerto Rico. Pero John, what I'm looking for is some information about whether or not you found any differences between males and females and age groups, and whether or not that's part of your future investigation, or you can take a stab at what you think now, as to whether or not, as to whether or not the sense, first of all, what they feel they're getting from other people, from the Latino community when they speak Spanish to them, and also whether or not the homophobia is less among the women or more than what you found among the men.
Yes, so
and
in
any
this,
differences, because como vieja me interesa estas actitudes de parte de los viejos, no solamente los jóvenes.
right. So in this little 20-minute skit I just did, I couldn't include everything that I found. It was a very difficult task to try to include the important points into this. But one of the things that I did find from a small sample size of 20 some odd people is that this seems to be a younger tendency. There was one woman, a professor actually, in a CUNY institution, who's in her 50s, one African-American woman that spoke Spanish. But the majority of people who responded to my announcement, were young people. I don't know what that will mean going forward, but I think that this is in the last, I want to say 20 or 25 or 30 years, but this isn't a phenomenon that I'm seeing primarily in people who are older than my age group. I'm 36, so most of the people in my study were 40-ish and below. And as far as gender goes, thank you for bringing up that point, because the most of the people who responded were females, were women, and young women. And I find that all of the people that I studied for this were women or gay men. So as far as demographics, that's what I'm seeing right now. Young women and young men and gay men. But no one really over the age of 45, and haven't been able to find any heterosexual male Black Spanish speakers. I'm not saying they're not out there, but as a preliminary kind of view of the data, that's the way it looks. And I don't know why that is. I know why for me that is, but and I saw my story reflected in a lot of the respondents, but it doesn't necessarily imply that that's the general rule, but I'm interested in looking farther into that.
Well, I congratulate you, and I urge you to go on with this analysis. Gracias.
Thank you, gracias.
Gracias. So, tenemos algunos comentarios que han ido surgiendo en el chat, and I'm going to summarize them. John, we have about 4 more minutes together with you at this time. So, one of them is around naming. So, is Afroamericanos, I'll put it in my own terms, was it a grounded sort of a term that you saw come from the data, or is it a coinage, or is it, tell us more about Afroamericano as a term itself. And then,
oh, okay. Go ahead.
I think so, but maybe a little more about yes, tell us a little more about the term. I know you mentioned.
I think I coined it. I think I coined it. Obviously, it's a translation of African American, but in this context, to say that and be referencing your ethnicity, saying you're Afroamericano, like, is a little bit different than saying I'm African American. African American, we all have an understanding that the descendants from African slaves that are American citizens in this country, 300 some odd years later, are considered African American. Not necessarily that that our parents or grandparents are direct immigrants from the continent of Africa, but that we're descendants of slaves, that version of African American, like myself. But Afroamericano, saying you're Afroamericano means that plus my lived experience has been a Hispanic, Latinx lived experience in a community with traditions and language features that aren't present in African American culture. So I think I coined it. I'm not sure. Other people are obviously using it, but it is what it is.
I appreciate that. And then there's another domain of questions, several echoes of it, around whether you encountered anti-Blackness in this work as you were in the field.
So I didn't encounter anti-Blackness from any Afroamericano that I talked to. One of the clips that I actually couldn't play, that I actually ran out of time to play, was the clip of the guy explaining that his channel, his language channel, is about appreciating culture and language and not about being anti-Black. He's not trying to give up anything that he claims, and which I kind of was, this is kind of what I built the section off of, the repertoire of identities, saying that this is an expansion of identity and not transracialization is an expansion of ethnic linguistic identity and not replacement. Most of the anti-Blackness comes from people who think that that's what you're trying to do, whether they be white or Black or Hispanic, but not from the people in the study. No. The theme of anti-Blackness came up when I was speaking about, Spanish speakers not wanting to communicate in Spanish with, person X because they don't think they're, native, but not necessarily poignantly anti-Black. Mm-hmm. Most of the anti-Blackness was coming from monolingual English speakers, not understanding why you as a Black person would be speaking Spanish.
Sort of policing the boundaries of that.
Yeah, policing the boundaries, like between how we choose to see ourselves and navigate the world.
Mm-hmm. So exerting power in that way. Thank you. Thank you, John. Let's give John another virtual, silent, audible round of applause. And I will toss it to Jose. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much, John. That was terrific. I think I need to get a little touchy-feely now, though. I'm just feeling so proud,
Oh.
I'm feeling so proud. I think that if I've done a thing right in my career is to surround myself with people who are a lot smarter than I am, and just listening to John present his research, seeing him having become a scholar who has such interesting projects, who has such interesting and illuminating things to say about very complex topics. You know, I'm feeling really proud. So I apologize for the touchy-feeliness of this moment, but I guess I wanted to say that. And, you know, one of another person, a lot smarter than I am, that is an outstanding scholar and a very dear friend of mine is Juan Valdez. Where are you? Right there. Here, there he is. Well, Juan's dissertation is the first dissertation I ever directed. I arrived at the Graduate Center in 2002. Juan joined the program right away, I believe, right, Juan? Llegaste al mismo tiempo, el mismo año que yo. And well, we immediately connected, right? It was an evident connection between us in terms of the types of problems of metalinguistic discourses with regards to language. And we were both, we immediately saw that there was a connection there. And well, we collaborated for 5 or 6 years while he was a student in the program, a doctoral student in the program. I learned so much. I learned so much from Juan. You know, I see a lot of faces of students who are taking seminars with me right now, and, you know, they could ascertain how often I quote Juan Valdez's work and have, right? I see Oriana laughing there because she has heard your name often in class. And what can I say? You know, Juan's dissertation on the linguistic oeuvre of Pedro Enrique Zureña is trailblazing work. It was published by Palgrave just 2 or 3 years, I believe, right, Juan, after you finished your PhD, Tracing Dominican Identity, the writings of Pedro Enrique Zureña, and a few years later, a Spanish translation of that book with Catarata in Argentina. And that book had a tremendous impact within the various discourses that trace the development of the Dominican Republic's intellectual life and how that intellectual life worked either to reproduce colonial racist hierarchies or against the reproduction of those colonial racist hierarchies. Juan was a professor at Michigan State University, at the University of Wyoming, at Cal State, at Queens College for a few years. But, you know, he was born in the Dominican Republic, raised there and in the Bronx, but he's un californiano. Él es un hipster californiano, tú sabes, Juan, siempre te lo dije. And eventually he just moved to the Bay Area and said, the hell with everything. I'm moving to the Bay Area and I'm going to be an independent scholar. And he's been there for a while doing tremendous work as an activist and with activists in the area, still teaching, still with connections to the field of education, publishing, being a part of intellectual debates. To me, Juan continues to be a constant source of learning, of information, and of friendship and warmth. So, you know, I could not be more honored to have you here, Juan, and to have the privilege to introduce you. So now, go ahead and talk.
Gracias. Okay. Thank you, Jose. You promised not to do your stand-up, but you almost made me cry. Gracias por esa introducción. It's wonderful to be here, not just with Jose, who was my dissertation director and a dear friend, but also some of my former professors like Bonnie Urciuoli, who was my first linguistics professor, and my dear mentor and friend, Ana Celia. And I see a lot of faces of my friends. So I'm really happy. Too bad that it took a pandemic to bring all these people that I respect and love together. But here we are, and I am happy. So let me try to begin. And I'm gonna try to share my screen. Just give me a second. Okay. So can you guys see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, gracias. So this is a new project for me that I recently began. It's like related to my usual, topics and questions of interest, language, race, and identity. And I think I was initially curious about this a few years ago, 17, the first time that I heard the word Latinx being used at a university. I was teaching at one university, and the term Latinx, I think it was around 2017 where I began to hear it often and around a lot. So that's when I first became curious, but as I started to kind of just pay attention to, what the discussions were about, I noticed a pattern in the discussions, or more specifically about where they were being had. So there was a number of articles that appear in mainstream media. And at the same time, there was like this debates and discussions happening in social media. I became more interested in the debates that were happening in social media. And it was a new terrain for me because most of my previous research has been based on archival materials. So basically what I am focused on right now are the justifications for preferring or rejecting either Latino or Latinx, the two terms that are being hotly debated in mainstream media, social media, and universities as well. I decided for this particular study to focus on the debates on Facebook through a couple of groups that I follow over Latino and Latinx. My methodological and theoretical approach is a mixture of tools and resources, which of course involve the glotopolítical approach, which looks at language as a source of conflict, of political conflict. I've done a lot of critical discourse analysis, and so it is a tool of analysis that I use a lot. And also by looking at how race comes in and plays a role in all of this through different associations of the terms and their respective identities. I am also applying the racial-linguistic lens. For my purpose in this study, I focus on the interventions or the contributions in the different spaces of debate by Gen Xers and some laypersons, journalists, all of who seem to prefer the term Latino, or who are fighting for their preferred term, which is Latino. And then on the other side, the people who are mostly in support of the term Latinx are millennials, progressive activists, and of course, US scholars. My preliminary findings so far point to two things. That the disagreement, there's a lot of discussion about like the linguistic reasons for choosing or rejecting a term as opposed to another. That is only superficial. When you look closely at the reasons that people are giving for rejecting or preferring one term, you realize that the debate is not necessarily about the linguistic merits of the term, but about the social positions that the terms kind of index or point to. So here we go. These are just some, I'm sharing with you images of some of those articles that appear in mainstream sources such as the LA Times, the New York Times. And then as far as social media is concerned, there's one particular video that I think came out, yes, in 2017 that sparked a lot of controversy, and is a video that is referred to in a lot of these articles. A video that garnered over 2,000 comments. And this is just like a short sample of some of the comments that reveal sort of, in this particular instance, the preference for or the rejection of Latinx, and the preference of either Hispanic, Latino, or Latin American. Although the majority of the people that were commenting on this video prefer or spend their time rejecting Latinx, you could see that there's some dissent over the preferences of terms such as Hispanic. Okay, so the media was, caught on to all these like different debates, and there were a lot of publications that tried to give different examples of the different positions that each group were taking in opposition to one term or the other. The one thing that these had in common, like this one from the BBC Mundo, published in Spanish, and then this one, which is a publication of the Marketing Insider, what they had in common was that they all ended with this set of facts that they wanted to get across, which is that mostly college-educated Hispanics were the ones that they either prefer two things, being called Hispanic or being called or referred to by their country of origin, their Latin American country of origin. And then another one that the fact that they describe a lot is that the ones that do prefer Latinx are usually millennials. Okay, two important things that I think have helped me analyze this data, to organize it and analyze it, is the distinction made between ethnicizing and racializing discourses. A distinction that Bonnie Urciuoli made in her book, Exposing Prejudice, back in 1996. And in that book, Bonnie tells us that both racial and ethnic discourses do the same thing. They racialize, but they racialize in different ways. So racialized discourse, for example, typifies a group of people as something out of place, something abnormal, dirty and dangerous, or unwilling or unable to do their part to contribute to society or to the nation state. That is one common characteristic of racializing discourses. Ethnicizing discourses, on the other hand, focus on the deracialization, the progressive deracialization of groups. So a group that once used to be considered a racialized group, through the process of ethnicization, can become less racialized. And this happens as a result of an emphasis being placed on culture and cultural characteristics. And there's many different kinds of characteristics, but one that kind of is very consistently used is this association of the ethnic group with success, with linguistic success, cultural success, educational success. So I want to share quickly just a couple of examples of what that means. So let me just, So here you have two books that have been published. I think this one is very recent, Auténtico, and this one it's a little bit older, which use either the term Latino or Hispanic to construct this sociological analysis of success for people of Latin American descent in the United States. Another document that I've been looking at is this White House roundtable that happened in June, I believe, in which a group of Latino and Latina community members, leaders of the Latino community, of the business community, joined Donald Trump in the White House. And what I have highlighted here is the transcript of that encounter, in which, interestingly, the word Latino appears like 2 times in the transcript, but the word Hispanic appears 24 times. And one particular comment that jumped out at me was this one by Robert Urciuoli, who unleashed a whole controversy with his endorsement of President Trump. And this is just a little excerpt from the video in which he spoke, and he basically lays out the ethnicizing discourse here and connects it to the ideology of success, in which he talks about his father, how his father was a builder, and he came to this country to build, to grow, and to prosper. And then other examples, some that predate the beginning of my discourse set from 2010, of books that discuss or that make this connection between the construct of Latino and Hispanic person and this link to success. And here's a question that this sociologist posed to his interviewees, and some of the typical responses were, again, just associating the theme of culture with the term Hispanic. And here at the bottom, you see an excerpt from the discourse that I've been collecting and gathering and analyzing. And this is by a woman who is from New York and has been very involved, very engaged in this debate on social media. And as you can see, she's rejecting the term Latinx, and she has very specific words to describe people who use it. But then what I'm interested in these comments at the end, where she talks about sort of her work ethic and her educational success as the reasons why she cannot accept the use of this Latinx, and the reasons why she identifies more with the term Latino. So in her view, Latinx kind of erases all of the things that the term Latino represents for her. Okay. Another interesting, thank you, I see the sign, Ariana. Another interesting proposal is by Daniela Hernandez, who's a writer and who also wrote an op-ed piece in the LA Times, in which she's proposing, instead of Latinx or Latino, the term Latin as a term that is kind of circumvents this problem of inclusion or non-inclusion. But what interested me in his explanation of his preference for this term is, again, the reason that the term is preferable because it does not make those associations with the racialized stereotypes that have been used to represent or construct people of Latin American descent in the United States. And he refers to the stereotypical caricatures of Latinos in the past. So these are just some images to illustrate some of those stereotypes that have been associated with these terms, the term that people like Daniela Hernandez want to get away from. Okay, so since I don't have a lot of time, I'm just gonna go over this real quick and then I'll stop. So I'm interested in those debates about this, but I'm also interested in other alternative discourses from racialized communities. So there's another group that I've been following who's having a very interesting discussion about what it means to be Black, what it means to be Afro-Latino. It's a Facebook group called Afro-Latinas. This is how they spell their name, founded in 2006, and that went through a name change around 2018. Anyways, this group was also having a debate over the course of months in which people just kept adding in terms of like questions and comments or disagreements that they were having. And the thread was started by a member who is Afro-Puerto Rican, who said that the term Afro-Latino was bothering him. And he was thinking about starting to use Afro-Caribbean instead. And then he asked people for their opinions. The first responses were, for example, by this man who is an African-American man who's part of the group. And this was his definition. Afro-Latino is a term for dark complexion. And then he gives like individual examples. But then someone chimed in saying, not just dark complexion. And then the African-American man immediately wants to make sure that he was not offending anyone. And he tries to clarify his statement. And then you have other people chiming in, like this woman who is an Afro-Panamanian from Brooklyn, who actually now resides in the Dominican Republic, who went there specifically for the purpose of improving her Spanish. And she has some very interesting things to say. But she is the one in this discussion that introduces the term Afro-Latinx, which then triggers a lot of other questions. And she also establishes her position of resisting these terms that she associates coming from white public space. Then someone asked about Latinx. The person asking about Latinx is an Afro-Costa Rican woman who lives in Alaska. And she describes her age, and she feels very old for not knowing what Latinx meant. But then the Afro-Panamanian woman chimes in saying that she is not young, but that the term is very recent. She was confused about it, and I think I skipped it, but oh, you cannot see it. But then she talks about how this is a term that has been introduced by academics. And then the discussion continues with very specific, I see you, Ariana, with very specific details about sort of where these people are or where they're supposed to be when they identify with one term or another. Okay, since I don't have a lot of time, I just want to say that, well, actually, I'll just show you this real quick, that two things, that this discussion for the most part is a English language ideological debate. So even though there are discussions about inclusive language, like making Spanish a more inclusive language, the debate is not about the use of Latinx or Latino in the Spanish language. It's about the use of Latinx and Latino in the English language. Yet, even though all of this debate, I think, is important to realize is produced in the context of the US, the very narrow, strict US binary paradigm of race in which everything is either black or white. There are instances with racialized ideologies from Latin American crossover. And I just wanted to share one example. So I am currently part of a racial affinity group that has this name, Raza Latinx Affinity Group. In our first meeting, which was a 2-hour-long meeting, there was a very intense debate about the use of the word Latinx. Most of the people rejected it. And one curious comment was made by a young woman, a young Mexican-American woman from California. And I was very curious, I became very curious as to her reasons for rejecting this term in the vigorous ways that she did. So then she chimed in, the Latino is the correct term because it establishes this connection with the concept of mestizaje, and that was very important to her, for her. And then she referenced Vasconcelos, right, whose concept of la raza cósmica refers to this, perfect mixture of European and indigenous people creating this race of the future. So that's important to me, this connection, because even though I have lived and I've been, educated here in the United States for a long time, I am very interested myself in maintaining this connection to the discussions of language and race and Blackness in Latin America. So don't have too much time to continue to discuss the importance of this connection for me. But I'll just end it by saying that what attracts me about this intellectual traditions of Blackness in Latin America are what I feel are this more like fluid perspectives and ideas about what it means being Black and what it means resisting colonial constructions of identity. So I'll just end it right now, so I won't take too much more time.
Thank you, Juan. I see the icon, the emoji claps. I can hear them resounding, and I welcome thoughts. We have some time here for folks to write stack in the chat, or I see one particular question around whether the term Latina emerged in your data collection. So moving from the O-A to the X to the E, if you saw that.
No, that one has not emerged yet. I haven't seen it in any of my discourses.
Any other thoughts, comments for Juan? Ana Celia, welcome. Yes.
No sorprende a Juan que yo tenga otro comentario que hacer.
No.
No, ni José, te veo sonriendo también. No joda. Mira, okay, I'm going to put the wait, we got to do esto es start video. Okay. Ya. Okay. Juan, primero, yo estoy confundida, como bien confundida. No entendí si tú estás a favor de uno. I leave you. Yo estoy como que lost now.
Yeah.
No entendí. I didn't get what your position was. I don't see you for, against, or in the middle. One, but that's neither here nor there. I have 330 questionnaires on this issue, which of course I've never published yet. And so I think that it's important to look at the language background of the respondents and their level of fluency with Spanish. Because what my study shows is that the Spanish dominant speakers, now of course that means also that they were raised often in Latin America, there are all these intersecting variables: the gender variable, the class variable, the education variable, the exposure to the United States variable, and the level of Spanish variable. You know that I have written against the X. I am for the universal U. I think it's a metaphor for a better inclusion. I think the E is too Frenchified and gets us into those kinds of details, but that's otra cosa. The group that I spoke with was against it because if you say the tall boys are, smarter than the short boys, you get impossible sentences in Spanish. And I saw somebody come in with some sentences on the chat in that impossible X to pronounce in Spanish. So I'm not against it in English, but I think that the repercussions for Spanish are very, very serious. And that's what I think should also be part of any analysis of this question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So just to clarify, so I do not take a position. My position, I guess, is like, call yourself whatever you want to call. I use in my effort to try to be inclusive, Latina and Latino. If someone
está como el Papa, y tú sabes que le cayeron encima al Papa.
Sí. I try to just be mindful of, like the interlocutor's preference. If they want me to call
Latina, Latino doesn't get to the gender inclusive aspect, which is why I'm for the U, because I think that gets into the gender inclusive aspect. It keeps the binary of the male female.
But like as an analyst, of like language politics, the thing is that Latino or Latinos is not being debated right now. So it's not part of the ideological. So I have to, focus on like what the source of the conflict is. And right now is this debate between the O, A, and X ending. But if I find Latine or Latino, and I will, pay attention and see where it fits in all of this debate.
The A is very much debated now in Latin America. Very big.
Oh, yes, but not in the U.S. ideological fight between the use of this term, which is mostly in English, not necessarily.
Exactly. Okay.
We'll take one more comment here from Bonnie Urciuoli, and then we'll turn to our speaker, Eva. Yes, welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you.
Bonnie.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
Great to see you.
So hi, Anna. So my question / comment is, one of the things that that intrigues me about this, and it's something I've sort of followed up in this project that I'm just wrapping up, is the whole idea that there has to be an overarching term. And I'm wondering, I'm not saying add this to what you're doing, but because I never, but I'm wondering, it's interesting to think about what are the agencies or institutional places through which there comes this idea that there has to be a term that everyone should use. And then everybody debates the term, because I'm going to guess that there have been other times and places, I don't know where or when, where there was no idea that there had to be an authorized term. So I guess what I'm actually raising is the interesting question of, isn't it interesting, the whole idea that there's supposed to be a term that covers all these contingencies, as opposed to classifications that cover more local contingencies, or where everybody kind of understands what does or doesn't fit in, and people don't get into arguments about it. So it's almost like the very idea that there could be a discussion over, should it be this, should it be that, does it include me, does it not include me, is an interesting product of a certain kind of society. And I just wanted to sort of throw that point out there as something, maybe, you know, if you have a comment or to, but it was something that your presentation made me think about.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and it's something that I wonder about. Yeah, why must we fight about, you know, the terms that we're using to like refer to each other, to call each other?
But
I think.
Bonnie, we went through this with she and he, and with him and her.
No, but that's not my point. My point, oh, sorry.
And said we're not in there. And in this case, many groups, trans and bi and other groups, are saying we're not in there when you have only the O.
Yeah, but I think what Bonnie is suggesting that like we think about is this overarching like problem of like why fight for the terms in the first place?
Or why the very notion that there needs to be a term. And can I give you a better example, and maybe it'll clarify it? All right, so I'm just wrapping up this book about how the term diversity means so many different things in different contexts. And, you know, when I was still at Hamilton, I gave talks about, you know, in the college about it. And I would always get faculty members come up to me and say, well, so what should the term mean? And I'm like, I don't know if it means anything. It's one of those terms that, you know, how you it, you know, depends on whatever. But what I found interesting was that I had colleagues who had, no, we can't use the term unless there's an agreed upon meaning for it. And it's that notion that there has to be,
that has to be agreed.
Meaning. If you're going to use the term X, it has to mean such and such. And I thought that was the interesting thing. And I had the impression that there was a lot of that, you were looking at a lot of that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do kind of with what John mentioned in his talk. There's gotta be this like overarching narrative, like things, like, you know, in terms of identifying with terms or have to fit into some narrative. But I would add that I think that the narrative has to have like an indexical term, like a term that we can easily point to and revert back to the positions that we take in our community.
Yeah.
So Latinx, Latino identifies these groups and where they are.
Very indexical, yeah.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Ana and Juan, and everyone for thinking and adding into the chat as well. We should be sure to save this chat because I think it'll spark a part 2, a sequel. And I want to be sure we have time to hear from Eva Wheeler. Welcome, Jose. I'm going to turn it to you, to turn it to Eva, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Thank you again, Ariana. Juan, when you get Anacelia Centella and Bonnie Urciuoli rolled up, you must be doing something right. You know, you must be doing something right. Anyways, I'm delighted, Anacelia. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Bonnie, nice to see you again. I also noticed that Jacqueline Toribio was with us. Laura Callahan was with us. Anyway, I was, you know, being nosy before and saying, hey, let's see who showed up. And there was a bunch of friends and super brilliant people that we've also learned from so much, right? And good friends too. Anyway, all right. It was 2016 when I attended the Latin American Studies Association conference in New York. It was in New York that year. And I did give a paper, or I organized a panel. I don't remember exactly what I did there. But anyway, I participated quite actively, attending various sessions. And I ended up in one in which, for the first time, I met a young scholar in Hispanic Sociolinguistics called Eva Michelle Wheeler. And her presentation blew my mind. It was truly terrific. I think, Juan, you were there too. You were participating in that LAILaC conference too. You know, I remember we talked during the Q&A, and when I got home, I immediately looked her up and started to follow her professional profile and what she was doing. She's a professor at Oakwood University in Alabama, where she does tons of things. They better pay you well, because you do a lot of stuff for that institution. There's something about Eva's profile that I find admirable, and it's that the fact that she obviously, when you look at her profile within the university, obviously she's not just a scholar who thinks of herself as the professor who transfers knowledge to students, but she's the type of a scholar who becomes involved with the students, who understands the co-construction of knowledge, and who understands that the knowledge that is produced within universities is organically connected to society. I find that aspect of Eva's profile fundamental, and I look at it as a model for you know, what I want to be when I'm a grown up. 3 years ago, we ran into each other again, and this was in Lisbon. Yeah, I was on sabbatical, and I was doing research in Madrid, and the two of us coincided at a conference in Hispanic linguistics at University of Lisbon. And once again, her presentation that had to do with language and race in the Dominican Republic, sort of the semantics of certain grammar particles in Dominican Spanish and questions of race. It was again a fascinating presentation. So I am honored, Eva, to be able to introduce you and to be able to have you as a guest at CUNY's Graduate Center, so to speak. I am very grateful for your having made time to be with us. I know you're always very busy, and I am very, very appreciative that you accepted to be a part of this event that is very, very important to us. So thank you, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jose. And I don't know if you remember this, but when we were in Lisbon in 2017, you said to me, I'm going to find a way to bring you to the Grad Center. I'm going to find a way to bring you to CUNY to do an invited talk. And I've been waiting for that invitation.
And you got it, and you got it.
And I got it. So I'm jumping in, you know, head first. Thank you all so much for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Before we jump into the substance of the talk, I really wanted to take a moment and lean into the panel's theme of centering Blackness in Hispanic sociolinguistics. So I'm a linguist whose research is informed and often inspired by my experience as a racialized body in various social cultural contexts. As a result, my work frequently inhabits the intersections of my personal and professional curiosities. As a part of my research agenda, I use language as a lens for the interdisciplinary analysis of social phenomena such as race, cultural otherness, and diasporic positionalities. Today's presentation fits into that broader research agenda by examining how the language of US Blackness and ultimately of linguistically expressed cultural otherness is rendered in translation. If I had to pinpoint the exact moment when I knew I was going to do this work, it would have to be January 2016. I was walking down Avenida 23 in the Vedado sector of Havana. Vendors had set up tables with secondhand books, and one cover in particular caught my eye. Habla Malcolm X, Malcolm X Speaks. I opened the book and turned to the first chapter. Yo soy un negro del campo. I'm a Black man. From the countryside? The Spanish translation seemed to read differently than Field Negro. Or maybe it was August 2012, when I was studying Basque in the Basque Country, and I walked into the classroom to see my teacher with a Randy Watson t-shirt that said, Chocolate Sexy. It was a nod to the band Sexual Chocolate from the movie Coming to America. Su camiseta gustats in sight, I said in Basque. I like your shirt. Esagutzen al lusu filmaori, El Príncipe de Zamunda? You know that movie? The Prince of Zamunda? Bye, esagutzen dut eta asko gustats in sight. Yeah, I know it, and I love it. Or maybe it was December 2018, when I was staying with friends in Santo Domingo, and they decided to watch the Spanish dubbing of the film Rush Hour. In one scene, Chris Tucker's character greets other Black characters using the intracultural expression, "What's up, my nigga?" Translated in Spanish to, "Mi negro." When Jackie Chan's character later repeats the same expression, a bar fight breaks out. My friends turned to me confused about why it would be problematic for Jackie Chan to say the word negro. ¿A los negros norteamericanos no le gusta que les digan negros? Do Black Americans not like to be called Black? If you stop and think about it, you can observe the ways that language and race interact just by looking out into the world. Racial labels, for example, are the words we use to designate ethno-racial groups, and these labels give insight into a society's system of racial classification and reveal the ways in which the society has divided people into racial groups. The connotations of these terms and the rules for their deployment may be determined by geography, time, or conversational context. Language can also mediate ideas about race through something called racialized linguistic practice, where racial ideas are imprinted onto language itself, and words, pronunciations, and grammatical structures become symbols of social meaning. Through this semiotic process, linguistic forms become associated with broader language ideologies and with cultural beliefs about language and about groups of language users. In entertainment, ideas about racialized language motivate Black characters to use their, quote, white voice on the phone in films such as Sorry to Bother You and Black Klansman. In real life, these same ideas about racialized language can motivate what John Baugh calls linguistic profiling and lead to discrimination in legal proceedings, employment, housing, and education. For this project, I draw on work that's been done on the translation of racial labels in film and the translation of racialized speech in literature. The translation of racial labels in film is a line of inquiry that has grown over the past decade. In these studies, researchers investigate the lexical choices that translators make and the strategies that they use to present racial labels to their local audience. The question of lexical choices directly relates to the inventory of racial terms available in a given language, and by extension, to the different forms of racial classification that a society has created. In translation, the gold standard is something called maximum equivalence. To reach this standard, translators employ three general categories of translation strategy: minimum change, intervention, or omission. A minimum change strategy specifically seeks not to intervene. Translators that employ this strategy may adopt the official equivalent for a given term, or simply retain the original word rather than translating it. An intervention strategy can involve the adoption of a more neutral word, a more offensive word, a paraphrase, or a complete substitution of one racial term for another. Finally, an omission strategy neutralizes ethnic charge by eliminating the racial term altogether. I am particularly interested in the balance between intervention and minimum change strategies and the resulting implications for how the experience of the cultural other is ultimately understood. When racialized linguistic practice appears in African American stories, the primary challenge that translators encounter is that countries do not have a language variety that is explicitly associated with a specific racial or ethnic group. The US, by contrast, has what linguists designate as African American English, which has over time been associated with African American speakers. Forms of this language variety are prevalent in the telling of many African American stories. In languages where dialects are primarily derived regionally or socioeconomically, translators who want to maintain linguistic distinctions from the source text have generally done so in two ways. First, by constructing a new dialect that suggests a lack of linguistic capacity, and second, by invoking an existing linguistic distinction that is primarily regional or socioeconomic and recasting it as racial. So the present study contemplates three research questions. What are the strategies that translators most frequently employ to render racial labels from African American film and literature into Spanish and Portuguese? What are the lexical choices that translators make as they translate the racial labels from African American film and literature? And how do translators interpret racialized linguistic practice from African American film and literature. For each of my original texts, I reviewed the stories and noted each use of a racial term. There were 1,681 instances of such labels. For each term, I recorded the word class, the source, and the surrounding context. Based on a close reading of each text, I also included the purpose for which the term was used, for a description, for insult, etc. The framing of the speech in narration versus dialogue, the speaker's race, and the audience's race. In this process, my goal was to think broadly about the variety of factors on the face of the text that could potentially influence the way that translators would approach the task of interpreting these racial labels for their local audiences. For the same text, I reviewed each story and transcribed portions of the dialogue where characters specifically enacted racialized linguistic practice. I then identified the linguistic characteristics of the racialized speech and recorded this information for analysis. For the analysis of the translation of racial labels, I reviewed available Spanish and Portuguese translations of each work. And for the racial labels identified in my first review, I recorded the translated term, the translation country, and the translation language, and then determined the translation strategy that had been employed. Once I had the data on translation strategy, I generated descriptive statistics such as frequency counts, conducted comparative term analysis, and worked with the team to prepare correlation analysis. For the analysis of the translation of racialized linguistic practice, I reviewed translations of each work and transcribed the dialogue related to the enactment of racialized linguistic practice. For each translation, I identified the sociolinguistic characteristics of the translated speech, determined the translation strategy, and performed a qualitative analysis of the work performed by the translation strategy. The data on the translation of racial labels demonstrate that in over 90% of cases, translators pursue maximum equivalence between texts by using one of two strategies, intervention or minimum change. Of these two common translation strategies, the most frequent by far is the minimum change strategy of adopting a term's official equivalent. Generally, this strategy is considered to be the most conservative approach to translation. In the context of racial language, however, it is necessary to consider how a minimum change strategy might actually disrupt the meaning conveyed by the original text in substantial ways. When it comes to lexical choices in the translation of racial labels, one issue that arises in the data is the case of overlapping official equivalents. When different terms in English, such as Black, Negro, and the N-word, are all translated to the same word in Spanish, then we have overlapping official equivalents. In a case such as this, translating all three English terms to a single Spanish term can be problematic for a number of reasons. The first potential problem, as demonstrated by the graphic on screen, is that of creating a translation that is completely nonsensical, as in the case of los términos negro, negro, y negro. A second problem, which appears more subtle but could potentially alter the text in greater ways, is when translators flatten out the semantic and pragmatic nuances of racial labels that have distinct connotative meanings in English. The graphics that appear on screen represent the rates at which the terms Black, Negro, and the N-word were translated to the official equivalent negro in Spanish or to negro in Portuguese. The data show that 78.3% of the time that Black is used, 90.7% of the time that Negro is used, and 44.1% of the time that the N-word is used, translators make no distinction in their translation of the three words. Consider, if you will, the very different connotations that these three words have in US English, the information that each term carries about time, geography, ideology, and the identity of a speaker. This approach flattens temporal and ideological nuances between Negro and Black. It obscures the fact that while the terms Black and Negro can be used in relatively neutral ways, the N-word cannot be a neutral expression, and in these data is always used to speak pejoratively about Black people. This approach ignores the pragmatic realities of who may deploy each term, in which contexts, and with what consequences. Ultimately, what is lost in translation are the ways that different labels function to highlight in-group status, to position oneself ideologically, to reclaim identity, or to intentionally enact violence against racialized bodies. The next step is identifying and analyzing the factors that might motivate the selection of a particular translation strategy. Here, chi-squared tests offer some insight. The graphic on the left reveals a statistically significant relationship between language and translation strategy. So in this data set, Portuguese translations were much more likely to have cases of translator intervention, while Spanish translations were more likely to use the official equivalent. And it's worth noting here that all the Portuguese translations in this study were done in Brazil, and all but one of the Spanish translations were done in Spain. So the different approaches to representing racial language could be related to the different ways that race in general, and Blackness in particular, are understood and described in Spain versus Brazil. The graphic on the right demonstrates that there is a statistically significant relationship between audience race and translation strategy. This means that when a speaker in the text uses a racial term for a Black audience, there was a higher rate of translator intervention and lower rate of defaulting to the official equivalent. On this slide, the first graphic shows a statistically significant relationship between the original term's purpose and the translation strategy. Terms deployed for the purpose of ethno-racial insult prompt higher rates of translator intervention. So here we think about the idea of the localization of insult and how a default to a term's official equivalent might not land with the local audience. The graphic on the right demonstrates that there is a statistically significant relationship between a term's framing and the translation strategy. That is, whether the term appears in narration, dialogue, etc. In these data, racial labels that appear in dialogue prompt higher rates of the intervention strategy. As we consider the extent to which factors such as purpose and framing may intersect, I'm interested in incorporating multifactorial analysis to future stages of the project. The final graphic demonstrates a statistically significant relationship between the original term type and the translation strategy. So whether the term is an ethno-racial description, a racial epithet, or another type of racialized word. In this case, racial epithets prompt significantly higher rates of translator intervention, whereas terms like Black and African American have generally accepted official equivalents in other languages. Racial epithets like the N-word do not find precise equivalents and thus prompt translators to intervene and transform the insult conveyed by the term into a form that the local audience will understand. The fundamental question when it comes to translating racialized linguistic practice is the role of language in the presentation of cultural otherness. As translators navigate the relationship between standard and non-standard varieties of a given language, the difficulty of the task is amplified when non-standard language varieties are also ethno-racially linked. To contextualize this analysis, I will engage dialogue from the film Black Klansman. In this clip, David Duke, a white supremacist leader of the Ku Klux Klan, is speaking on the telephone with Ron Stallworth, a Black detective who has infiltrated the Klan. Prior to the exchange in this clip, Stallworth asked Duke if he is worried that some smart aleck Negro might call one day pretending to be white. Duke says no, because allegedly he can always tell when he is talking to a Negro. Stallworth asks for an example and Duke proposes the verb form are and suggests that Negroes will insert an additional unstressed syllable and pronounce the word as ara. The linguistic phenomenon that Duke references here does exist in American English. It has been linked to the southern region of the US and is widely associated even to the present day with African American speakers. The challenge for translators then is engaging and rendering the racialized sociophonetic form, ara. As previously discussed, translators generally represent features of racialized language varieties using one of two strategies: by constructing a new dialect with linguistic features that imply a lack of linguistic capacity, and by invoking an existing linguistic distinction that is primarily regional or socioeconomic. A Latin American Spanish dubbing adopts the film translation, the first translation strategy, and renders ara as está.
¿Me darías algún ejemplo? Sí, la palabra está. Un ario puro como tú lo diría de la manera correcta. ¿Está? Y un negro diría, está. ¿Te diste cuenta? Dicen, estás pensando freír ese pollo frito hermano del alma.
This rendering imitates almost exactly the linguistic phenomenon represented in the English version of the film. It alleges that speakers who are culturally other will add a superfluous additional syllable to the conjugated verb form. The difference between this phenomenon and aura, however, is that this pronunciation, etiza, is not a sociophonetic characteristic that exists in any variety of Spanish. Although this invented phenomenon is not linked to any cultural group, its placement in the film functions to portray Black speakers as possessing a lack of linguistic competence. This approach introduces new linguistic structures into the conversation on racialized language varieties and suggests a linguistic point of reference with which the target audience has no lived experience. By contrast, the peninsular Spanish dubbing adopts the second translation strategy and invokes the characteristics of existing regional varieties of Spanish to represent cultural otherness.
¿Me pones algún ejemplo? Sí, la palabra estas. Los arios, como tú y yo, la pronunciamos bien. La pronuncia esta. ¿Entiendes? O sea, está friendo ese pollo. Sabrosón, hermano.
In this representation, translators render aura as está, with a marked aspiration of the syllable final S. The aspiration is a characteristic of various existing varieties of Spanish, including varieties from Andalusia, the Canary Islands, and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. Syntactic features such as subject pronoun placement and morphological features such as the formation of the adjective sabrosón suggest that translators are locating linguistic Blackness in the Caribbean. This approach capitalizes on existing linguistic differences and potentially introduces a new reference point for the conversation on racialized language. By examining the strategies that translators employ to render racial language from one context to another, researchers are able to examine how ideas about racial and cultural difference can be deconstructed and transferred from one context to another via the medium of language. For racial labels, we have observed the predominance of the minimum change translation strategy. We've also observed the potential limitations of this strategy in the context of translating racial language and concluded that minimum change strategies do not do the work of maximum equivalence here. This is most readily observed in cases where different racial labels have overlapping official equivalents. In these cases, strict adherence to a minimum change strategy flattens the nuances of racial language. This could be framed in terms of the additional semantic work that this requires of the words that have been positioned as official equivalents, but also, and perhaps more importantly, the practice erases the violence that racial language performs on people who have been both racialized and marginalized. The data related to the translation of racial labels also give us an idea of the features of a text that are significantly correlated to translation strategy: language of translation, audience race, and the purpose, framing, and term type of the original racial label. For racialized linguistic practice, we've observed how translator intervention functions to preserve distinctions from the original text. These interventions additionally prompt considerations about the centrality of intervention translation strategies in preserving key distinctions made in the original stories. Thus, it is necessary to consider whether we are asking translators to step into a new and more expansive role by making these types of interventions, or whether strategic and well-researched interventions may actually serve the objective of maximum equivalence better than strict adherence to the minimum change strategy. I end on this note. Broader implications. First is a consideration of the ethics of translation. Whereas here, translators are tasked with rendering the voices and the stories of marginalized groups, how do the stakes of the translation change, and what might those elevated stakes mean for the selection of translation strategy? Translators must consider how to arrive at maximum equivalence in a way that does not erase or mute the voices of marginalized populations. Thank you so much for your attention, and I welcome your comments.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you. We welcome comments. Yes, anyone in the stack, anyone in the chat box. We were discussing in a research group that I am leading that very term, las vidas negras importan. A few weeks ago, and thinking about, and Anthony Harb, who I would give a shout out to, doctoral student in LAILaC also here, was raising some really important nuanced questions around the translation of importar and how different readings of that particular term changed the significance of the phrase. We have one question in the chat, speaking of terms and their significance, of who does the actual translations, right? What can you tell us about that?
So on the literature side, it was much easier to identify because the specific translator's name would be printed at the beginning of the work. On the film side, it's been a little bit more difficult. Generally, so for when I looked at Black Klansman, for example, the Spanish translation that accompanies the English version of the film, they don't acknowledge who did it, right? Which company did it, which country it was done in. And then for the peninsular Spanish dubbing, I wasn't able to decipher the names of the person that did the translation and more just information about the production company. So what I was looking at was maybe a regional type of analysis to see if there were some patterns that would emerge in translations done in Spain, right, versus Spain and Portugal versus Brazil and other sites in Latin America. And so one of the patterns that emerged from that question was the fact that translators in Brazil were intervening and not opting to use an official translation more often, right? And so when they were using racial labels for different purposes, they were using terms that were localized for their audience that made sense in their context. And in the case of the Spanish translation, there was a much higher default to the official equivalent, which made me think about the layers of nuance in that idea of cultural otherness that might exist in Spain versus in Latin America, right? In Brazil, where they would have as many or more terms to designate layers of Blackness, right? Degrees of Blackness and difference in a way that perhaps in the Spanish context would not exist.
Thank you.
Eva, should we switch to the gallery screen?
Oh, yes.
We have a comment from Aiden Malanowski. Do you want to join us and tell us what you
Hello. That was a great talk. I was actually just about to ask about racial terminology in Brazil and what influence you think that would have had, but you basically just addressed that. So yeah, my question has been addressed. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Aiden. I see a comment that says, you know, the part about the peninsular film dubbing tying Black speech to the aspiration, right? That aspirated syllable final S was interesting. And that was one of the first things that caught my attention, right? Because I heard it and I was like, okay, something is happening here, right? And then later in the film, they return to that usage and add an intonation feature that hints that that specific location of linguistic otherness was Cuba, right? In the way that the speaker invokes kind of the intonation. And I thought about this idea, right, of invoking a linguistic other and invoking a cultural other, right? And then locating them specifically in a group that really does exist, right? And what the reaction is or was, that's something I have to look into further from speakers from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean who are in Spain, right, who view this film and see themselves positioned as the cultural other, right? And if that seems consistent with what their experience has been more broadly, or if it is something that is a surprise. I suspect it may be the former.
There's a comment in the chat to that effect too, around positioning this work within understandings of globalization, of diaspora, as you say, right? And so the import for language and ideology, certainly, but then also in translation, literature, but then also for the circulation of these forms and the position taking, right, in relation to. So since I gave him a shout out and since he is in the stack, Anthony Harp, yes, welcome.
Hi, thank you for the presentation and thanks to all the speakers. Yeah, I decided to pick up your invitation, Ariana, to keep this conversation going. I think what's interesting to me about the translation is like of Black Lives Matter is that, you know, just thinking about what those words like mean and what they're used for, right? The way that we use matter in English in the US, right? To sort of, you know, talk about importance. There's some level of materiality in that word too, like physical matter, right? But it's, and then I'm thinking about this in the context of like the all lives matter, where this is sort of perceived to be, that Black Lives Matter becomes perceived to be something about superiority, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking about that in relation, and in this conversation that Ariana was talking about, I looked up the definitions, right? And in importar, there's a second definition, right, that has to do with like preocupación, with worry, right? So there's this sort of meaning of care that is kind of in the importar that might not be in the matter. And so I was sort of I was teaching my students, right, about linguistic relativity and thinking about like how the way that we speak is like constitutive of how we can perceive the world, right? And so what those translations mean in terms of what those particular uses can, allow us to perceive about what that movement means. And yeah, so I was just thinking about that. It's really fascinating to think about translation and what that kind of does, what like the effects of that are. Yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much. I don't know if any of that comment you've thought about any of that or.
No, yeah. So I hadn't thought about the definition of matter, right? I had been focused more on the racial label at the beginning. And so the matter question brings in an interesting additional consideration. I do remember I was on Twitter and I accidentally stepped into like las vidas negras importan. And it was a whole, there was this discussion, this debate going on, las vidas negras no existen, right? And so people were like, Black lives don't exist. What are you talking about? Like, you shouldn't say Black lives, you should say lives of color, right? And so there's this whole conversation about how do you take a concept from one social context and then transplant it into another? And then what are the potential precarities, right, that emerge in that situation? Because just like you highlighted the difference between matter and importar, there are these differences between, in English in the US context, we're fine broadly saying Black, right? And so we're like, Black lives matter, right? But if you go into another context where negro is seen as something that shouldn't be used to describe people, right? Or shouldn't be used as a group identity, then you've lost, part of that message before the conversation even began. And so I've done a lot of thinking about, how do we, at the beginning, I was treating this racial language from the US context, right? I was stepping into this project from my vantage point as an African-American, right? And so for a lot of my research, I'll step into the context of my research. So when I'm looking in the Dominican Republic, I'm like, let me step into the Dominican context and start the inquiry here, right? But in this context, I started from my positionality as an African-American. And at the beginning, I was like, let me hold up this racial language, right? Let me protect it because, we have to understand the different layers and the different nuances, right? And as I was going through the analysis, I realized, thankfully, right, that it wasn't about these specific terms. It was about how we negotiate cultural otherness, right, and cultural difference, and then how you maintain those distinctions in a way that does justice to the experience that these different people and characters are having. And so what does that look like when we translate a text to Spanish? What does that look like when we translate a text to Portuguese? And that's kind of the question that I'm continuing to engage as I'm going through the analysis.
Thank you, Eva. I think it's probably time for us to begin to adjourn, to tie the together. I think that is a wonderful ending point in terms of thinking about our work and ourselves, the implications of our work situated within social movements. It certainly is what prompted Jose and I to want to organize this event. It suggests a really, it calls, I think, for exigently, like that part 2 that we alluded to earlier, the sequel. We know Carmen has been attending to the chat and will be saving it for us. And I think there are lots of, beginnings there from where we're concluding. I do want to give Jose the final word. Thank you for sharing this time and this space, and anything you'd like to say to close, Jose.
Nothing, just to join you, Ariana, in thanking the panelists. It was a treat. I think the quality of the presentations speaks for itself. The comments that they triggered. I mean, I'm certainly excited about going for a second edition of this. This cannot be just a one time. It takes a lot of work to get these topics to come to the center of Hispanic sociolinguistics. So, you know, we're far from done. We've barely started then. We know we will never end struggling to reorganize the priorities of Hispanic sociolinguistics. So, you know, it was terrific. At some point we had 85 people. Now there are still 61 people in this event. And I think it has been terrific. Thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you, Ariana, for, you know, being crucial to the organization of this event. You know, and our friends and colleagues, Miki Makihara, Cici Cutler, and Beatriz Lado joined us today. You know, the three of them, together with Ariana and myself, are the five active faculty within the Hispanic Sociolinguistics track of LAILaC. And that's basically it. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your work. Yes.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll be in touch. Eva, Juan, John, we'll be in touch with you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you.
Carmín, guarda el coso este, ¿cómo se llama? El chat.
Sí, ya lo tengo.
Ya, súper, súper. Besos.
Chao.
Bueno, abrazos.
Chao.
Gracias, chao. Muchas gracias.
I'll write to you guys, eh? Eva, John, y Juan ya marchó? All right, he's gone. He's going to go andar en bicicleta por allí, por el Bay Area. I know it.
It's still like 5 o'clock out there.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Eva, lovely to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you,
And
Emma.
John, when the pandemic is over, come visit in New York, all right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, un fuerte abrazo a todos y todas.
Yes, adiós. Thank you,
Chao.
Gracias.